Phones stopped mid-gesser. A waitress's hand hovered over a tray of champagne, as if someone had frozen the air. At the top of the marble staircase, a slash of midnight blue silk caught the chandelier light and folded it into movement. Conversations thinned into whispers. For a room full of people who measured themselves by the brands on their wrists and the logos on their invitation cards, nothing had prepared them for that moment. A woman who had been dismissed all evening as the maid, stepping down into the center of the ballroom, wearing a Renault gown, so precise it seemed to have been stitched out of the night itself. Hand-embroidered crystals cascading like a small, deliberate constellation. The murmurs folded into one single word: Renault. Purportedly valued at $2 million. At the foot of the stairs, Yoon Hye-won's smile liquefied. The socialite who had put the invitation in her hand as a joke. The woman who, in certain circles, answered to a nickname half savage and half exotic, whispered between guests as the Mafia wife, because of the dangerous prestige of her marriage. Felt every eye retract from her like a tide pulling away. That label lived in rumor and in the hushed sentences people used to measure power. It did not mean cold facts of crime, only a reputation that made mothers clutch purses tighter at fundraisers and made hosts place their most important guests near the exits. Tonight, the rumor's halo did not protect her. If you love dramatic reveals, hit subscribe. It was supposed to be easy, Jan thought earlier, over white wine and a smear of lipstick. She and a few of her closest friends had laughed at the absurdity of inviting the housekeeper to the gala. The kind of cruel, glittering laugh that sounds like crystal against crystal. Wear whatever you have, she'd said with a sharp amusement, designed to leave no wiggle room. The phrase landed like a stone. Trite, dismissive, meant to show her dominance without lifting a finger. It was an old trick, a public poke to remind someone of their place. A social seasoning designed to amuse the wealthy. The joke was not cruel in her view. It was part of ceremony. Humiliation, in that room, was entertainment. But there are calculations that only a conscience can make. Gabrielle Renault had listened to that laughter through a thin kitchen door and had felt no small shock of recognition. She was a black woman who moved through the world with a calm that the staff called steadiness. Neat in a way the guests never noticed, efficient in ways that rarely drew attention. She had handled the coats and folded napkins for months. What the room did not know was that Gabrielle's choice to live in plainness had been deliberate. Years before, she had been born to the house of Marguerite Renault, a name synonymous with couture, and with a certain unforgiving standard of taste. Gabrielle had made a pact with her mother, an experiment in humility. A wish to see how the world viewed her unadorned self. It was not a game, it was a study. And she had learned more in quiet kitchens than in any atelier at, she called Paris the week before. Her voice on the line to Marguerite was steady. There was no hint of the double life she was about to puncture. Marguerite, who had spent a lifetime translating women into gowns, listened and then laughed a careful laugh. "You will do it your way," she told Gabrielle. "But do it with truth." A trunk of fabric was shipped overnight. Not as an opulent gift, but as armor and testimony. A midnight blue, Renault. A cocoon of craftsmanship with hand-embroidered crystals that caught light the way a careful phrase catches gossip. Marguerite intended the dress not as spectacle for its own sake, but as a statement about seeing. Gabrielle understood. The gala had been a basket of small cruelties, dressed as entertainment. Hye-won's friends, the ones who cultivated scandal the way others collected art, had arranged the ticket like an insult and assumed they would all laugh later as they compared photographs. Among them, they joked about the audacity of having the help among the help. They did not concede that the human beings they mocked might have been wearing an experience they could never afford. Knowledge, patience, a form of dignity that doesn't depend on a label sewn into a dress. They were not cruel men and women of violent acts. They were people conditioned to think that invisibility was a fact of life for some. That evening, they would learn it was a position that could be refused. When Gabrielle arrived, She walked differently than a person trying to hide. She moved with the precise calm of someone who had rehearsed tenderness and consequence. Her hands rested at her sides, unadorned, and that was the first shock. She had chosen modesty of jewelry to let the gown speak. The fabric fell, and when the first camera flashed, the light hit the crystals and exploded. Phones rose. Social feeds began to stutter with uploads. The ballroom, a small world of glass and lacquer and well-kept secrets, tilted. Haiwan tried to call out control with a tight laugh, but it sounded like something that had been admitted to the wrong hospital ward. The friends who had planned the joke felt the air change on their faces. They had expected embarrassment. They had not accounted for the power of someone choosing her moment. Gabrielle descended the steps and did not rush. That stillness was the point. The guests leaned in like witnesses at a slow trial. The Mater D looked embarrassed for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Someone dropped a glass. The sound made a small bright arc in the room, and for a moment everyone held their breath as if something fragile might break. It did not. What broke that night was a pattern. "Isn't that someone?" began, and then stopped. Because the name itself carried weight, Renault. The people who clung to salvageable reputations felt the fluorescent light of their social standings grow thin. Haiwan found her voice and used it like a blade. "Gabrielle," she said, loud enough for the tables nearest the stairs. Her tone cut. There was amusement and a public cataloging of status. "How lovely that you could join us. Wear whatever you have, dear." The words were the same she had spoken in the back room with the smugness of her friends, but delivered into the room's new geometry. The phrase changed. It landed on Gabrielle like a challenge rather than a command. Gabrielle did not need to respond with a monologue. She let the dress answer. She allowed the room to process that this woman could, at any hour, call down a garment that had been built by the best hands in Paris. There was a kind of justice in that. Not a vengeance, but the restoring of an omission. The omission that had allowed powerful people to believe that people like Gabrielle were invisible. A hush spread, then a rustle of cameras, then the quiet reconfiguration of alliances. The clip, 3 minutes long, in standard vertical format, would later become a social fossil. It would be spliced into headlines, stitched into commentary about privilege, and retold 1,000 times in living rooms and on trains. But in the ballroom, in the raw moment, people reacted first and thought later. Some applauded, not all, with sincerity. Some whispered resentful things about showmanship. The better people in the room, the ones who had not laughed, felt a small shame. The worst of them felt their superiority cracking. Later, the husband spoke in a tone reserved for negotiations and more consequential errors. Cho Dong-wook found Haiwan in the privacy of their parked car, the city lights folding into low justice around them. He did not shout. He did not make the mistake of theatrics. He articulated stakes. "Apologize," he said, clipped. His voice was the kind that commands rooms without raising volume. "Or understand what you will lose. I will not stand as the husband of someone who becomes a liability. You can be forgiven, but cleanly." And now, it read like a threat, until you realized how domestic it felt. An ultimatum about social survival, not a criminal verdict. Cho Dong-wook's reputation, the whispers that had attached to him like shadow gossip, made his words cut because people believed that to be on the wrong side of the social ledger had real consequences. Haiwan's world, oriented by tickets and seatings, now tilted into a place where other people counted things differently. Dignity, remorse, learning. She had to choose. Her apology, when it came, with murmured and sincere, in the odd way that sometimes happens when being alone with your mistake and someone you have belittled. She asked for Gabrielle in a low voice at the end of the night, as if confession might be kept as one more thing to file away. Gabrielle accepted, not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of power. Forgiveness, in her hands, did not erase the teaching. She allowed the talk to be gentle and to be a moment of learning. She did not gloat. she articulated, calmly. Something that landed like an arrow in the middle of Haiwan's chest. Real status, she said, is revealed by how you treat the people you think you don't need. That sentence would haunt Haiwan for long after the gossip died down. It would be the seed of the small transformation that followed a rotation toward humility and, eventually, service. For Gabrielle, the reveal was not a climax but a hinge. She had known in advance what would happen: the phones, the reposts, the temporary fury of the elite. She had planned enough to make the spectacle meaningful and minimal. The spectacle was not about a dress being expensive. It was about reassigning the gaze that presumed an order. That is why the gown she wore was a statement, rather than a showpiece. It was reportedly valued at $2 million. Yes, but that price tag was not what she wanted the room to focus on. She wanted them to see that their assumptions could be proved wrong, and more importantly, that they had consequences. Public reaction was immediate and modern. The clip of Gabrielle descending the stairs was reposted with the gleeful cruelty of commentary. Some posts praised the moment as a lesson. Others complained that wealth had replaced taste. The press, ferocious and kind in equal measures, ran pieces not about the dress but about what it signified. A conversation about who is seen, who is erased, who gets to define worth. The elite tried to reinterpret. They tried to reassert their ordinality by speaking about charity and inclusion in the same sentence as mockery. It did not quite work. The moment had already rearranged social furniture. In the days that followed, the pressure on Haiwan was less about physical consequences than about social ones. Invitations quietly stopped arriving. Conversation with certain friends became measured and brittle. There is no law for what an ostracized socialite endures, but the etiquette of exclusion can be as punishing as any other sanction. Her husband, practical and efficient, had given her the choice that night: reconcile or face the slow collapse of her curated life. Haiwan chose reconciliation. It was not the runaway success of a converted villain in a fairy tale. She showed up at a small meeting with Gabrielle and Marguerite, hands slightly shaking, face softened by the rare occurrence of humility in public circles. She apologized. There was remorse behind the words, the kind that comes from being shown the other side of your conduct by a person you have misjudged. Gabrielle listened. Marguerite watched the exchange with the sort of guarded kindness one would afford a student who has to learn a hard lesson. This was not the end of consequence. Gabrielle used the attention the way a steward uses wind, to harness it into action. She announced a project she called the Invisible Collection, a line inspired by and dedicated to the people who make many wealthy lives possible without being seen. The collection would not be a publicity stunt, but a curated effort, meant to elevate the craft and labor of domestic workers and small artisans whose hands keep the world running, invisible. Marguerite would design pieces with Gabrielle's eye for understatement. Funds raised would go to training programs and stipends for workers in need. The first show would invite domestic workers and hospitality staff to sit in the front row, to be recognized rather than imagined. Gabrielle insisted on that detail. There were those who whispered that this was the final flourish of a woman born to luxury, reclaiming her birthright through philanthropy. Maybe that was partly true. Gabrielle had resources, and she used them. But she also used the moment to argue for a deeper cultural shift, the value of visibility. She believed, and she said plainly, that when you place people in the front row, they begin to be counted. The choice to invite people who had never been clients, who had never been honored at runways, was a moral stance more than a marketing strategy. Haiwan, who had tasted emptiness and learned its bitterness, decided to volunteer. It was slow at first. She arrived to folding stations and hem tables with a brand new humility. These were small acts that did not erase the past but did build new habit. Her volunteer work was awkward at first, hands unsure of the tasks, but her willingness to be a novice in spaces she used to dominate mattered. It was not a pure redemption arc. It was human and tentative. Gabrielle watched the progress, sometimes impatient, sometimes forgiving, and offered opportunities for Haiwan to learn without spectacle. The public loved a neat, moral story, less than they loved messy human change. This was the mess, and it was honest. Marguerite, ever the designer and the mother, sat with her daughter in a small atelier back in Paris months later when the Invisible collection debuted. The room smelled of steam and lavender, the air warmed by the breath of sewing machines. The first models wore garments that paid tribute to work-worn hands aprons, reimagined as capes. Subtle pleatings that nodded to the folds of bedsheets, embroidery that read like fingerprints. The people who had once been background noise sat in the front row, applause on their faces like a new language. Cameras clicked, but the important faces in that room were not the ones who would run the reviews. They were the faces of the workers whose labor had always been present, yet never named. Gabrielle walked the runway at the end, not as a show of ego, but to signal that visibility and honor are mutual acts. She did not gloat. She spoke with a voice that had the soft weight of someone who had chosen a radical life. "This is for those who make our lives possible, unseen," she said. "Come and sit where you belong." The ripple effects were modest and lasting. The collection did not convert every patron of exclusivity overnight. It did, however, allow people in the less visible professions to feel counted in a way they had not before. It made Haiwan uncomfortable in a way that fostered change rather than collapse. It taught a generation of guests at subsequent galas to think twice before crafting a humiliation. Meanwhile, the viral clip of the dress remained a shorthand for a cultural turn. People debated whether spectacle could lead to justice. Some argued that the very act of using wealth as an instrument for teaching risked replicating the same dynamics of power. Gabrielle welcomed that critique. It was important. Her project was an experiment in the ethics of visibility. Could a member of the elite leverage resources to make space for others without reasserting superiority? She tried to answer that by structuring the grants and the programming without making herself the axis. She used her name not as an end but as a tool. There were private reparations too. Haiwan, who had been raised among people who polished surfaces rather than examined the lives underneath them, started to show up in community kitchens and at worker training sessions. At first, she fumbled with the work, scratching out an apology between awkward smiles and clumsy stitches. Over time, her hands learned different rhythms. She listened. She remembered the words Gabrielle had said on that staircase. "Real status is revealed by how you treat the people you think you don't need." Those words were not a cudgel. They were an invitation to remeasure life. Chodong. Wuk watched this transformation with a guarded pride for a wife who stipulated to become more than ornament. He remained what he had always been, a man who guarded the family's reputation and operated by the arithmetic of consequence. But even he acknowledged that the son's calculation of power must be balanced by the simple arithmetic of human dignity. He arranged introductions to training programs, to partners who could scale the Invisible collection's philanthropic reach, because he believed in social stability and, deep down, because the idea of a household healed was more preferable to a household that could hemorrhage in public. In the months that followed, stories of small kindnesses accumulated. A woman who had served dinners for decades was given a scholarship to train as a textile designer. A team of hotel staff who had made a wedding seamless were photographed in a campaign that credited them by name. Haiwan learned to knit in public. Her hands once trained for luxury, now shaping a modest beanie for a newborn. Gabrielle returned to her life, walking both worlds, the atelier and the kitchen, with a grace that people sometimes mistook for quietness, but that actually came from an enormous interior clarity. The moral was not tidy. Nobody's life was wholly changed overnight. The elites did not melt into universal enlightenment. The gossip columns still had opinions. But the important thing was that a choice had been made visible. A choice to refuse invisibility and to insist that dignity be the measure of worth. Gabrielle's actions did not eradicate the structures of privilege, but they did create instances where the old logic could be questioned and sometimes overturned. When people asked why Gabrielle had chosen such a theatrical method, instead of simply confronting the insult privately, she would answer with a paragraph that was simple and unshowy. She wanted to reassign where the attention landed. Private conversation matters, but public moments instruct more widely. If only one person learns to see another differently because of that night, she would say later in interviews. Then the dress did its job. Her tone was never celebratory about money. It was a sober calculation about the leverage of visibility. Years from that night, the phrase "the Renault stairs" would serve as shorthand in certain circles for a moment when social presumption was appended. People would tell the story framed as an anecdote about wit and spectacle. But those who had been there remembered it as a small rupture in a larger history. A place where assumptions were challenged, and where an act of generosity turned an intended humiliation into a lesson about power. Yun Haiwan's life smoothed into something quieter. She found, in time, that folding someone else's life into hers with humility was a strange relief. She volunteered as a liaison to help bridge salons with vocational programs. She did not become an angel. She remained human, flawed, and learning. Gabrielle, meanwhile, continued to split her hours between designing with Marguerite and running community initiatives. She never called herself a heroine. She called herself deliberate. The ballroom moment remains cinematic. A woman descending a staircase in midnight silk while phones flashed, but the lasting image Gabrielle wanted to leave was humbler. People given seats they had not been offered before, names uttered aloud, hands raised in class. That is how she measured success, not by the price tag attached to a dress, but by the number of formerly invisible people whose work and faces were now part of the conversation. When asked whether she regretted living anonymously for a time, Gabrielle would say no. The experiment had given her a perspective that was rare, to live in different worlds and to learn the rules of each. She used that vantage not to lord over others, but to build a small ladder for those below. The dress was a moment. The program was the work. The story did not close with revenge or with total victory. It closed with choices. Haiwan choosing humility. Cho Dongwook choosing public accountability. Marguerite choosing to support a project that honored labor without spectacle. And Gabrielle choosing to make visibility into service. The moral clarity of that closure did not rewrite human complexity. It asked the simple question again and again. Whom do you see when you think you see nothing? Share your thoughts below. Would you have done the same? Subscribe for more stories like this.